Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Knopp, CEO and co-founder of Pequity, the leading compensation tech platform. I also am a former compensation manager from companies such as Google, Instacart, and Cruise Automation, and I am here to continue our brief education on how to do all things comp, including how to handle compensation cycles like a pro. Now, as a reminder, we do have a series of videos to help get you to this video in the in the plan. So you do need to get market data. You need to understand how your pay practices compare to that market data. You need to develop a pay philosophy, which will be part of this video a little bit too. And once you have that philosophy, you need to create ranges. Now, usually you actually follow this process in the month to 2 month lead up to your merit cycle. Reason being is that if you want to use your ranges to start hiring people, you need to make sure your current employees are paid within those ranges. So today, we're going to talk about using that market data and trends to determine the budget for your merit cycle. And it, yet again, is something that you'll have to revisit annually. All of this is an iterative process. So once you do it the first time, usually that's the hardest time, but then you have to maintain it thereafter. So when you are creating a merit cycle, at a minimum, you're going to have to answer the following. One, how do you determine cash and bonus increases? Two, what are the criteria and increase amounts for promotions? Three, what is the eligibility for all of these factors? Who gets an increase? Who's eligible to be promoted? Four, what is manager involvement? Are they planning at all? At what level? Five, equity and stock management definitely is going to be part of this. If you have stock plans, you need to talk about, are we giving increases for promotions? Are we going to give it for a refresh program? Is everyone eligible? Very critical for your comms. And six, you need to find a software or system, which we'll go a bit more into. So typical answers that we see for these questions in 2022, a 3.4% increase was the average. That tends to be about the rate of inflation, but this year in 2022, we know inflation was a little bit crazier. Look at the data. How much did it go up from last year? What do you see as typical for the roles? Did the midpoints change drastically? That's likely going to change your budget. And it's okay if the average increase across the org is not the same by team. Generally, it's easier, but you do need to look at where are people going to fall against the range and how does that compare to their market target rate? Because you don't want to just say, hey, everyone gets 3%, and then realize that inflation was so high that you're going to lose talent because they're not actually paid their market rate anymore. Next, for promotions, just note that you should know not just the percentage of increase for promotion, but how much of your org do you think is going to be promoted? Your business partners typically have a good pulse on this. I generally give guidance of about 10% of your org should or will be promoted each year. This will be higher or lower depending on the year. If your company processed a layoff, if they're in a highly competitive market, if they're rapidly growing and hiring a ton of people, I would expect this rate to be higher, as close or even above 20%. For eligibility, typically you want someone to be in their role for 6 months. Any shorter, they just got hired at 3 months, it's a little iffy. 6 months even could be a little bit iffy depending on the maturity of your org. But for smaller companies, 6 months is a great indicator because it's fast moving. You might want to reward that person to give them the recognition they need to stay longer. Next, I often see that for manager involvement, director plus plans equity and managers and below plan salary. That does not have to be the way that it goes, but generally when it comes to equity planning, the belief is that you have to have a forest eye view, and that tends to be at the director level. If your company is small, it could even be that the VPs or the execs are the only ones to look at that. Reason being is that equity price is constantly changing depending on when someone started. Their strike price, their preferred price, if they have options, could have changed. RSUs, the grant could have been much larger. You need to be able to see the full context of everyone and how they're performing to really plan for something like equity, which is why Director Plus tends to be the typical way. For equity refresh, I like to call out that usually is 25% of what you would pay a new hire. So if you just redid your ranges, it'll be about 25% of the midpoint. And for a promotion, equity is the delta between their new role and the role that they're leaving. So if they were an L3 and they're going to an L4, it's the delta of those two that you should calculate. You can either do that by the midpoint of the L3 to the midpoint of the L4, or the delta of that person's vesting to their new role midpoint. That is completely up to you. But across all of these elements, if you have ratings, you also have to determine if that impacts anything. If they have a stronger rating, for instance, are they more likely to get promoted? Are they likely to have a higher salary increase? Are they likely to get a larger equity refresh? Typically, the answer is yes, but sometimes it's a no. So you need to make sure that that is part of your compensation planning, because if you are unprepared for a slew of high performers to come in and blow up your budget, it will be a bad day. And the final thing is your system. Most companies use spreadsheets. There's nothing wrong with that. I've used them for the majority of my career. But if you are sick of that, there are tools out there. I did do a shameless plug for our platform, which is way more flexible, has a lot of the logic. It's all of the things I wished every tool I'd used in my past had. But if you do not have a system in place, go out, vet the many that are, or the several that are out there. And spreadsheets are a great fallback, especially if it's a small amount of planners, such as just directors. You can definitely get away with that for a cycle or two, and they can help you educate on the logic that you want before you go into a system, especially if it's a system that's not as flexible or nimble as Pequity. Now, all of that probably sounds like easy peasy. I can bake that out, no problem. But there are other considerations that you need to discuss. One is, how are you going to ensure pay parity? One of the paramount things that I had baked into Pequity from day one is a process to monitor the pay by gender and race, just as an admin, as well as to make sure that there's a way to export that information to do a pay equity test if you want to. Not every company is ready for that, and that is perfectly fine, but you need to discuss, how are we going to look at this? What metrics do I want to measure? And loop in your legal team when you're doing that conversation. Next, you need to talk about your rounding rules. It is basic, but that can really skew a budget, and it can really mess with your managers if you have a rounding up to $1,000 and they have a budget. Just pay attention, make sure you agree on it, do a couple models, and if you need help, again, Pequity can do that for you. Next, as I mentioned, are you going to use ratings? Are they going to determine the increase? I recommend ratings. I really like using a comp ratio matrix. We have a proprietary version at Pequity that we offer to our compensation cycle customers. But if you don't have one, I recommend you look it up. I also recommend that if you don't have ratings, that you talk about how you're going to model people and how you're going to measure if there is discretion to make sure, again, that there's pay parity. Now, after all that's determined, you also have to talk about your managers. You're going to need to train them. You're going to have to talk about, what can they see? Are they able to see ranges? Are you going to show the budget to them? Are they going to see other employees' pay? Are they comfortable seeing their employees' pay? Is it okay if there's an employee paid more than them? Have they ever seen pay before? All of those things are critical to having a good program and might help you determine where your planning level is going to fall. It might make you want to stay up higher in the exec, VP, or director level. For the fifth one, I usually recommend a comp calibration. It is not required. It typically does happen at larger companies with the HR team, but are you going to have one? That is where you look across the org and you do some of these checks and balances. If you do plan to do one, you need to bake additional time into your process, and you should have some agreed mitigation plans. If you see that a couple of managers added a lot more for the same role, level, and performance than another team, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to go back to the manager and fix it? The answer should be, in my mind, yes, but that's something to discuss beforehand and make sure that your team is comfortable with before you proceed. And finally, this is one that can be a hot topic, but can employees be paid below and above their range? Seems basic. You have a range. The answer probably is no, but that is easier said than done. If you have an employee who's below range, for instance, and they're a low performer, and you don't want to give them an increase because you're trying to actively manage them out or figure out a performance plan for them, you need to talk about that, because from a comp professional's point of view, you should have everyone in range, from the HR business partner over that person They might say they don't want to give an increase because that sends the wrong message. And for people who are above the range, you might be like, yeah, of course, we're not going to give an increase to them. They're frozen. But what if that's your critical employee? What if it's your top performer? Are you sure you're not going to give budget to that person? You need to have a plan for all of these before you go into a comp cycle, and make sure it's something that you can bake into your budget or your logic so that you don't overspend or send a spreadsheet to someone that gives them a heart attack because they see their critical employee with a 0% increase. Now, if this sounds overwhelming, completely understand. You don't have to worry. You have a trusted person, your friendly neighborhood compensation professionals at Pequity who can build your budget and compensation cycle logic for you. If you'd like to learn more, reach out. Our comp cycle tool just launched, and we can have you up and running with a recommended budget in half the time, as well as bake all of your logic in for you and review the way that you're planning for people with the above methodology to let you know what we would recommend to either do better or a little bit differently.